Okay, I think it's 10 o'clock. We should kick off. So, welcome everybody. It's a real pleasure to have you all here at this health impact event at the University of York, showcasing some of the UK's best health research, which just happens to be coming out of the University of York. We've been a force, the University of York has been a force for excellence in health research since its founding over 50 years ago. And human health, I think, is one of the cornerstones of our research focus, research themes. In recent years, we've increased our focus in this area. We've appointed dedicated research champions in the domains of health and well-being, and justice and equality, and there'll be more on that this afternoon. And we've also launched the York Biomedical Research Institute, which will, its goal is to coordinate health research in the biomedical domain across the university. In addition, since 2011, we've been participating in a strategic venture with the Wellcome Trust, something called the Institutional Strategic Support Fund, to jointly fund interdisciplinary health research. And together, the University of York and the Wellcome have contributed more than $5 million to date towards this goal to fund, first through the Centre of Chronic Diseases and Disorders, and then C2D2, if you remember that, and then secondly, through the Centre for Future Health, its successor, to fund interdisciplinary health research across the university. The Centre for Future Health now distributes research priming across the university, so many of you here will have been recipients of Centre for Future Health and C2D2 funds, and our focus has been on interdisciplinarity, impact, and translation. And so the initial phase of these funding streams were interdisciplinarity, and we've achieved very good interdisciplinary research across the university. Our focus is now switching towards impact and translation, and you'll hear much more about that in this conference. We also fund longer-term projects. So, for example, we fund a cohort of fellows, postdoctoral fellows, some of whom are moving among you right now, or sitting among you right now, and you'll be able to see some of their work in the poster session. And all of this is contributing to our overarching vision of funding the very best of translational research with global reach over the next, forever. We're a forever institute. This morning, the focus will be on technological solutions to healthcare. And we'll kick off with keynote speaker, Dr. Bob Dougherty from California. There'll then be a series of short-ish talks. We have a system to make sure they are short, from University of York researchers. And then there'll be a question and answer session here. So you have the opportunity to ask questions, both of those speakers and of Bob, before lunch. And then in the afternoon, we're switching our focus to social issues and social health issues. And we're honoured that our afternoon keynotes will be delivered by Professor Sir Michael Marmot, the director of the UCL Institute on Health Equity, and author, for those of you with slightly longer memories, of the Marmot Report on Fair Society. Sounds like a lot of work. You'll be relieved to learn that we'll be providing regular refreshment throughout the day, so there are coffee breaks in both the morning and the afternoon sessions and lunch, and then a little drinks reception afterwards for those of you who can stay. During those breaks, we're going to make you work for your refreshment. So you may have noticed that outside in the atrium, there are posters, there are exhibits from industrial collaborators, and we encourage you to go and move around those exhibits and posters and ask questions. You'll be able to talk to the research fellows from the Centre for Future Health, you'll be able to talk to other researchers at the university, and people from the local area who are doing really excellent work in global health and impact. Oh, I've been asked to remind you that the atrium extends around the back to something called the 360, which is a sort of an immersive theatre. And apparently when people are having events like this, that often gets neglected because it's tucked around a corner. It's really brilliant, and if you go in there, you're surrounded by sort of immersive health-related video exhibits, so please go there as well. I've written here, it's a beautiful day. Bob, it's a beautiful day for York. So please, if you get a chance, also go outside and just enjoy the campus, the lakes, and the pods that are sitting on the lake outside. And then finally, a few housekeeping details. So in the unlikely event of a fire, there are exits where you came in, and there's also an exit here. And you can follow me out if there's a fire. I've been asked to remind you that there will be AV, there's filming going on, but the filming happens this way. So you are not on camera, as far as I know. Is that right? Yep. Mm-hmm. Your audio responses will be captured, but you yourselves will not. And also, could we all please turn off our phones? That's the other thing. Bob. So our first keynote speaker, it's a real absolute privilege to introduce Dr. Robert Doherty. Bob started his research career in the psychology department of Stanford University. Actually, I think it was before, right, in Vancouver. But I met Bob in psychology in Stanford in the late 90s. And at that time, human brain imaging was just really being invented. And the nice thing about being at the start of a field, especially if at Stanford, is you get to define it. And so Bob has been pivotal, really, in developing a whole host of techniques which are now in common usage throughout the brain imaging community, mostly focusing on measuring quantitative measures of the brain, so things about the brain that have units, millimeters and centimeters and amounts of water. And that lets us do things like measure the connections that neurons make between themselves as the brain develops. And it also allows us to address questions like what happens to the brain in the presence of disease. And Bob's worked on diseases related to vision loss and also reading disorders. Many of you don't know, but he worked a lot on reading disorders and dyslexia. Bob became the director of the Stanford Center for Neurobiological Imaging in the early 2000s and continued to do groundbreaking research throughout the early 2000s in that position. And then a few years ago, Bob made the decision, I says difficult decision, but I'm not sure it was difficult, to join a company based just off the Stanford campus. And there are many startup companies based off the Stanford campus, but Bob chose one that was related to neuroscience and health called Mindstrong. And Mindstrong is bridging the emerging fields of AI and predictive health and personalized medicine, and consists of, he'll tell you in a minute what the team is, but it's an all-star team of health researchers in the US, and they're going from strength to strength. And I'm really excited to hear more about where they're heading. So if you could please join me, thank you, in welcoming our first keynote speaker, Dr. Bob Doherty.
All right, thank you, Alex, for inviting me and for that kind introduction. So I want to pick up where Alex started, maybe go back a little bit. I actually started my career in visual psychophysics, did a little auditory psychophysics as well. And then when I went to Stanford, it was, I think, the late 90s, as Alex mentioned, to do neuroimaging work when it was just getting started. And I just want to start, before I get into it, with a little story. And I don't know if you remember this, Alex, but one day I was biking down University Ave through Palo Alto on my way to campus, and this new startup logo caught my eye because it was very colorful. And it was in this little tiny office above a pub, Brody's Pub, I think, which unfortunately is no longer there. But it was Google, of course, and I heard about it from some friends as well, so I went and checked it out, and I did some searches. I thought, wow, this is a great search engine, but how are these guys going to make money on this, right? And what I, of course, didn't get at the time is the value of the passive data that they would collect, and how they could take advantage of it, especially with advanced machine learning algorithms. Works. So passive data is quite pervasive. It's, our smartphones. Which one is the laser? Is it that one? Oh, there it is. Okay. So our smartphones are probably the densest source of passive data. There's wearables. Now we're starting to see devices in our home. Your thermostat might know what temperature you like it when you're home, when you're not. Your smart speaker can learn stuff. It knows your voice. It can do voice analysis if you want it. Even your refrigerator might start to collect information about you, what you eat, right? I just heard also smart TVs. They can learn a lot about your habits, right? So all these things, what they're doing is taking advantage of natural human behaviors, right? So in the case of Google, I want to search for information, so I go to Google. In the old days, I would have gone to the library, right? And unless you were there spying on me, you wouldn't know what I was doing. But now, because I'm doing this online, I'm leaving this digital trail. Same with when I go shopping on Amazon, or if I do social activity on Facebook. All these things are now traceable. The data's there. It's just basically for free if you're one of the companies that's positioned itself to take advantage of it. About 5 years ago, Paul Dagum, who's the founder of Mindstrong, approached me. He's he has a PhD in computer science, but then he decided that wasn't enough, so he wanted an MD. So he got his MD, was doing his residency at Stanford. So and then he went off and started a couple companies, kind of unrelated to healthcare. But then he came back. He was kicking around Stanford. We met, and he told me this idea of using passively collected data from smartphone usage to learn something about cognition and brain function in individual people. And I was quite skeptical, to be honest. But then I thought back to my experience with Google and how I missed that boat. And so I thought maybe I should hear him out, and maybe I helped him collect some data to prove the concept. And a couple other folks who were part of the early days of Mindstrong, Rick Klausner. He was the head of the National Cancer Institute in the US. And he's also a serial entrepreneur, started many companies, and a guy named Tom Insel, who was the head of the National Institutes of Mental Health in the US. And Tom had left a few years earlier to join Google, Verily, and then he left Google to join Mindstrong. So it is an amazing team, and that's partly what convinced me to leave Stanford and join. So let me just get into it now. So what Mindstrong is focused on is mental health, right? And it's a big problem in the world, right? So healthcare in general is very important to lots of people, and mental health is particularly impactful to society. And these are just some of the numbers here. I find this to be an interesting analysis, right? So we're looking at the disability, the effect of the disease burden based on the disability-adjusted years. And so you can see of all the different diseases, especially in this wide age range here, mental health issues and behavioral disorders are the dominant cause of lost productivity. Depression actually is a major part of this. It's one of the most, it is probably the dominant thing that causes people to lose productivity. And these are the kinds of problems that we're trying to tackle, right? So mental health in particular has had some poor outcomes. And Tom Insel, this has been his mission for many years. He joined NIMH. He left his own lab to work at NIMH to work on this issue, and he had a blog there and famously expressed his disappointment that the progress really hadn't been as fast as he really wanted it to be. These are I think three of the big reasons for that. There's really a lack of outpatient care and follow-up. So if you're being treated for depression, you go in, you see your therapist or your psychiatrist or a therapist, and you go away. You might see them again in a month, and in between, there's really not much happening, right? In the case of a different chronic disease, such as diabetes, we now have really good outpatient care, and in between visits to see your doctor, we can help make sure that you maintain your blood glucose in a healthy range. The comorbidity cost is something worth thinking about. People who have a mental illness are less likely to successfully manage other medical conditions, say a heart condition or diabetes. So there's a big comorbidity cost. And failure to diagnose is a big cost. So there are high-risk groups. For example, children who are exposed to traumatic events are at higher risk for depression. And if we could, do something to help catch say they develop depression early, we might be able to reduce some of the negative outcomes. So our approach is to look at the passive smartphone data that I mentioned. And so this is the number 2,600. That's the number of times an average person touches their phone in a day. And we have lots of data now. We have over 1 billion touches on disk from almost 5,000 subjects, hundreds of thousands of subject days. And this number is pretty close to accurate, but it's actually a distribution with a very long tail, because there are people with 15,000 touches in a day. I like to think of each one of these touches as a little psychophysical event, right? So you have a visual stimulus, you have a goal in mind, and you make a motor response. And if you do that a couple thousand times, it's a lot of opportunities for us to learn something about how your brain is functioning. And I'll try to, I don't know if that's intuitive to most of you, or maybe any of you, that we can actually learn something useful from those random touches. I know for myself, the reason I was skeptical when Paul first approached me is because I had spent my early career doing psychophysics, where psychophysics, you very carefully control everything, right? The stimulus is precisely controlled. The quanta of light coming out, you would want to get that level of precision if you could. And here, you're just letting people do whatever they do normally. So how can that work, right? Just one note that smartphones are just everywhere, right? And this is both interesting and maybe sad. They're more ubiquitous than clean water, plumbing, and electricity. And I like this quote from the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice that if aliens came down, they would think smartphones were an important feature of human anatomy. And they're just growing, and especially in developing areas of the world, they're growing much more rapidly, pretty much because the first world areas are saturated at this point. So how can we actually learn something from these uncontrolled behaviors that you're doing? So the analogy I like to make, I'm not sure it's really an analogy, I think it is one and the same thing. If you look at, say, a professional athlete, someone who achieves expert performance in something, in this case, it's very visible. That's why I think it's a good example. So here's Steph Curry taking a shot, and he will probably make it, unless the crowd is cheering against him, or maybe he has a slight sore muscle. Those things, he's so good, those things will affect his performance in a noticeable way, in a measurable way. And the same is true with how we use our phones. Once you've been using your phone for a few weeks, you're an expert. And as I said, the dominant behavior is typing. And so typing, I don't know if you remember when I first started typing on this flat little screen, trying to use that little keyboard, you're pretty bad at it, but you get better at it. And this is just an example of the asymptotic learning curve that you see in most human behaviors, or animal behaviors in general. And once you've achieved that asymptotic performance, and you're at your peak performance, any little perturbation, mental or physical, will disrupt that performance. And the fact that we can measure the key presses with millisecond precision allows us, even if it's just a 10 millisecond sort of random jitter or delay, or 10 milliseconds slower in each keystroke, or your variance from the key press goes up by a few milliseconds, we can see it because the phone is so accurate at recording it. And that's the basis of what we're getting at with the Mindstrong measurement tool. I just want to point out, most of you probably know this, but for some people it comes as a surprise that even a simple task, such as typing on your keyboard, will involve pretty much most of your brain. So primates are very visual animals, so pretty much the back third of the brain is doing visual processing, and is helping you interpret that visual stimulus that's on your screen. You have to make decisions, and they could be simple decisions, but even so, frontal cortex would be involved. because if you're typing out a message, we've seen with neuroimaging that even spoken language areas will be involved with that. Broca's and Wernicke's area will often be activated even when you're reading or composing written language. And of course, motor cortex. These are precise motor movements, and they're very coordinated, especially if you type with 2 fingers. So the cerebellum would also be involved. So it's pretty much your whole brain is being involved in this seemingly simple task. And so you can see how any problems that start to develop in that brain could disrupt those behaviors. It could be very subtle, you won't notice it, but your phone could notice it with its millisecond precision. So this is the basic idea, and I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide because it kind of sums up what we do. I should mention there's other data you can get from the phone, and there are other companies and research labs looking at all these different things. J.P. O'Nella at Harvard has been focused on the sensor data. So as you know, the phone has accelerometer and gyroscope, often has a magnetometer, a compass, GPS. So we can learn something about activity. These sensors would allow your phone to know how many steps you take in a day, right? You can guess when people are sleeping based on these. If somebody is a very avid smartphone user, as soon as that phone is sitting on the table, as soon as these sensors are not moving for a few hours, you could be confident they're sleeping. And location, of course, you know where people are going. You could learn where they're going. And if you look at phone calls and text messages, you can learn something about social behavior. As I said, we've been focused on the human-computer interaction. We think they tap into these core kind of aspects of cognition. Voice is also something you could look at, especially as more and more people use voice interfaces to their phone. That could form another source of data. But as I said, we're focusing on the human-computer stuff. I should mention, it's a good point, the digital trail of data we leave all over the place can be used for, I hope good in this case. It can also be used for more nefarious purposes, to sway a political election or a referendum vote, for example. And so we have to be careful. And for us, as a healthcare company, trust is crucial. And so we don't want to collect any more data than we need to. So for example, with the keyboard data, the way we collect the data, we could record exactly what you type. And we would know exactly what sentences you typed. But we don't want to. So we just know, we get the millisecond precision timing. We know if you typed a character or a punctuation or a space or delete. We know if you did an autocomplete or if you selected a auto-suggestion. We know, if you made a mistake, it did an auto-correction. But we don't know the content of what you typed. So that's very important. And we also feel it's important that we are a healthcare company. We're not Google also trying to do healthcare. Because even with best intentions, there could be leakage across, from the healthcare to the advertising part. So that's really important. So we get all these data, and I'll explain a little bit more about what they are, the patterns that we look at with the interaction. But in general, all these patterns get run through machine learning algorithms for what we call feature extraction. So we take the raw data and kind of get at it's essentially an intermediate stage that we call the digital phenotype. And here's a little more detail about what we're doing. So there are actually a total of 45 patterns. They're generally based on a few consecutive actions on the keyboard and scrolling actions. As an example, it could be character, character, character. You're in the middle of a word. Space, you've ended the word. Or period, you've ended the word. Or comma, you've ended the word. Delete, obviously you made a mistake. Delete, 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 you made a big mistake, or you changed your mind about what you wanted to type. Typing on the keyboard and then scrolling and then going back to typing, it's a task switching. That's an important one because it's again, task switching, an important cognitive function. And so there's a total of 45 of these patterns. And we think, and we have evidence, they kind of tap into different cognitive domains, different patterns do. We create a time series of these, and we're currently doing a 24-hour window. So we look at all the typing events and all these patterns, the time series of events over the 24-hour window. We do have a concept of a session, so we know, like, if you do something in your messaging app and then you put your phone down for a while and pick it back up, that's a different thing you're doing now. So that's taken into account. And we take these time series of events, and a total of 20, there's nothing magical about this number. It's our currently the number of transforms we're applying. These are basically standard signal processing algorithms. Just taking the mean, for example. The mean of your character is your raw typing speed. The variance of character is the variability in your character-to-character typing. We do spectral analysis and just other kinds of standard signal processing techniques. And these form a total of 1,035 potential digital biomarkers. I should say we don't get all these on each person each day. We get about an average of 500 to 700 of them. And that's just because some of the patterns are a little more esoteric, and you just don't do those in a day. So the core set is about 500 to 700. Here's the first paper Paul published to kind of describe the proof of concept study that was done. And it was a battery of gold standard neuropsychological tests. These are the same kind of tests a neurologist might order if they suspected you might have a neurological condition. Getting at things like working memory, executive function, language, general intelligence, problem solving kind of things. I'll show you some of the data. These are, this is just showing, for example, up here, it's digit span backwards. And we're showing the predicted value and the real value is in blue, the predicted value is in red. And so, it's not perfect, but we can learn quite a bit. We can actually explain about 60% of the variance in these cases, in this case. And yeah, these are some of the other domains. Animal fluency is a verbal fluency task. Can't read that from there. Symbol digit modality is up here. That's a kind of a rubric solving task. And the block design is down here. It's one of the IQ tests. And so these are cross-sectional. So we're explaining the variability across individuals in this case. And this is kind of proof of concept. It's not really what we want to be doing. We don't really want to use these as IQ test replacements. We developed, I should say, the machine learning algorithms we used in this case. It's something called Supervised Kernel, PCA. And I don't have time. Actually, can you keep track of my time, Alex? How much do I have? Okay, great. So I can say a little bit about the algorithm, Supervised Kernel PCA. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with principal components analysis, but it's a purely data-driven way of reducing the dimensionality of data. So we have 700 features on a person in a day. That's a lot. It could be that you can combine some set of those features. Maybe you could take 100 of them and combine them in a say, some linear, maybe even a nonlinear way that gets you a couple of features that really do better than any one of them alone, right? So you get an additive effect. And PCA will just do that blindly. It'll just say, okay, let's reduce it down to get rid of as much variance as we can. But the supervised part means you actually have a target. So say I have my 700 features and I have a working memory task. So now I can say, okay, don't just randomly reduce these down to get rid of most of the variance. but actually try to get them down to the components that best explain this target, and that's a supervised learning. It's a machine learning, a type of machine learning. The kernel part just means we can introduce nonlinear aspects. So PCA is a purely linear method, and if you add in a kernel, you can make it a logarithmic kernel or a radial basis, and so you can get nonlinear aspects of the data in that way. And so that's what was done here. In the end, it ends up being, you can think of it as a regression, a fixed effects regression. So you're explaining the cross-subject variability. But we want to get at longitudinal effects as well. And so we developed some of the math, and we have an example. This paper's not published yet, but we have a preprint online, and it should be out soon. And so I won't get into the math. It's basically, in the end, it boils down to modifying the supervised kernel PCA to add the longitudinal component. We call it SKL PCA. Sickle PICA. We're not good with acronyms. Essentially what it does is it makes it into instead of a fixed effects regression, it's a mixed model. So it includes both fixed effects and random effects. The random effects are the subject-specific effects. And so it can take account of longitudinal data. Here's one of the data sets that we use to show that it does something useful. This is actually from our collaboration with University of Michigan. It's an interesting study where they follow medical interns who are doing their first year residency, and of course are very sleep deprived because of that. And every year, they've been doing this for several years, they follow the ones who volunteer to sign up for the study, which many of them do because they're very interested in it. And in this case, they were wearing a Fitbit, which measured their sleep, among other things. And so we were able to, and they also had the app on their phone, so we got the passive phone data, we got the Fitbit data, and we were able, in this case, to predict, sorry I didn't label this axis, but this is the prediction and the actual average hours slept over a 4-day window. So if you don't get enough sleep in one night, it doesn't actually have an effect. We can't see an effect there. But if you don't get enough sleep for a couple nights in a row, you have a consecutive sleep deficit, we can actually pick up those effects. Pretty big correlation. Each different color is a different subject, and then within a color, it's all the different longitudinal time points for that subject. And here's just a few example subjects picked at random. And you can see the black is the truth, or the Fitbit version of the truth. And the old model without the longitudinal component didn't do very well, but when we add in the longitudinal component, we can actually, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. We can do a pretty good job predicting, or in this case, knowing when someone didn't get enough sleep the night before, or the couple nights before. Here's another study that also took advantage of the SKL PCA algorithm. So this is a study we funded within Mindstrong, and we did it in collaboration with a ketamine clinic. So these are patients being treated for otherwise treatment-resistant depression. And I don't know if you've been following the story of ketamine as a depression treatment, but ketamine is approved in the US, at least, as it's approved by the FDA as an anesthetic, and it's only available in injectable form. It also happens to be a recreational drug. It causes hallucinations, and some people like that. So it's probably that latter use that people discovered that it actually relieves depression symptoms in kind of an episodic way. You take a hit of ketamine, you kind of trip out for a couple hours, and if you were depressed, suddenly for the next week or two, you're not depressed anymore. And it's pretty much an instant effect. People, the next day, they're in a much better state than they were before. It's considered, the effects are similar to ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, as a treatment for depression. And we're not so interested in ketamine in and of itself, but as a way of seeing, having patients who are going through these big swings. And, every few weeks they're depressed, and then they're not depressed. They're depressed, they're not depressed. And so we did the study and had them install the app, and we did several different kind of ground truth or gold standard measures of depression, the Hamilton Depression Index. We also looked at the Hamilton Anxiety Index. SHAPS is an anhedonia measurement, and the Clinician General is another kind of index of how well people are doing. And we did, at least for these three especially, not so much with CGI, but we did very dense sampling. Every few days, these are structured interviews, so these are not self-report. We had a single rater, a single person, expert in administering these, basically do the interview every few days while they're going through their cycles of ketamine treatment. And these, the data presented in a kind of unusual way. So this is one subject here. This is another subject who didn't have much data. Here's another subject, and we just strung them together just so you can see both in one chart. You can see the within subject prediction accuracy and the cross subject effects. So we can, see some subjects are kind of baseline is higher than other subjects, but within a subject we can do pretty good predictions, and the cross subjects we can also predict pretty well. And you can see some subjects, we followed them for quite a while, get a lot of measurements. This is not published yet. We're writing it up now. We're actually collecting another bolus of data to we ended up, after excluding subjects for basically subjects who weren't responding to the ketamine, we only ended up with, I think, 10 or 11 in this case. Yeah, 10. So we're doing 20 more subjects, so we'll be publishing that soon, hopefully in a couple months that'll be out. If you're going to use this in a clinical setting, if you're going to use these tools to say something about individual patients, then this kind of analysis is actually quite important. This is what's called a receiver operating characteristic, or ROC curve. It looks at the sensitivity versus the specificity as you go through different thresholds. So in this case, normally it would be a diagnostic classification, depressed or not depressed. And in the case of the ketamine study, we chose a clinically significant change in this case, HAM-D score, HAM-A score, or the SHAPS score. And we asked, okay, can we predict those clinically significant jumps up or down in that score? And so we had, if you go through different thresholds on the prediction, the prediction is a continuous score that comes out, 0 to 1, and you can threshold it anywhere you want, and you can, get very low sensitivity, very low specificity and meet modest sensitivity, or you can go the other way and get, if you set the threshold differently, you can get very high sensitivity, and the specificity, this is 1 minus specificity, so the specificity will be low. And so the area under the curve is a good measure of how well you're doing, and an AUC of 0.83 is actually quite good compared to other tests like a mammography for breast cancer is much closer to 0.5. It's barely above 0.5 actually, which means it's not predictive. So at least in this sample, we're doing pretty well, and so this has provided enough of an incentive for us to think that this actually could have clinical utility. I want to show this. This is, so everything I've been talking about up until now is the raw features, what I call the intermediate 1035 features, run through machine learning algorithms. One thing about machine learning is you're susceptible to what's called overfitting. If you have a model with a lot of parameters and you fit data, especially if you have more parameters than data, you can fit it perfectly if you want. So you have to be very careful not to overfit. And so cross-validation, everything I've shown was cross-validated. That's critical. So that means you train your model on a subset of the data and you test it on a set of the data that you left out, that you didn't train it on. And if you overfit, you'll do great in the data you train on, of course, but you'll be terrible predicting the left out data. So you have to, while you're training, you constantly iterate between this, and often you pull one chunk of data out, train, test, get a model, you take a different chunk of data out, train, test, and kind of modify the model and update it and improve it so that it does kind of gets the optimal balance between best predicting the data without overfitting it. We always also do what we call a permutation test. So after we get a model, there's still a chance it was overfit, especially if you don't have a huge, thousands to millions of data points. What we do is then we scramble the association between the features and the targets. And so we take subject 3's phone data and match it with subject 10's HAM-D measurement, for example. And hopefully, if you've overfit, then you run that same model, that same procedure with the scrambled data, and you'll still get a decent correlation. And that means you overfit, and there's a problem. So we always make sure that we have an overfit using that. But this is another interesting look at the data. These are actually the raw features. This is a subset of the 1035. It's too many to put in one chart, so we thresholded and eliminated ones that didn't have a decent number of statistically significant correlations. So these are just a set of different, these are all, I think, mostly cognitive tasks. So, for example, this is a Trails B from the ketamine study. This is the PANS. It's a kind of a depression self-report index, a reaction time task. There's just a bunch of different tasks and a set of features, and the color indicates the correlation just with that feature. So there's no machine learning here. There's no fitting. We're just taking your phone data, just straight out of the phone and run through our signal processing algorithm, but it doesn't know what the outcome, what the target measure is. And we take the target measure and say, what's the correlation? And of course, we're doing lots of correlations, so some of them are going to be statistically significant by chance, so we use false discovery rate. In this case, we set it to be a pretty conservative 0.01, meaning only 1% of these statistically are likely to be false discoveries, a false positive in this case. The individual feature, and you can see the correlations themselves, the magnitude of the correlation isn't huge. 0.3 is a pretty good one, and we have quite a few in that range. And then I didn't point it out, but when we do the machine learning that takes a set of these, maybe takes 50 of these that have a pretty good correlation with, say, Trail B, and combines them in a way that gets even better correlation. So we get this additive effect by combining features that kind of tap into different aspects of the prediction. So this is just to show that the raw data themselves actually, without any massaging, any playing with the data, actually show a relationship with the target measures. All right, so I'm just going to give you a little teaser of some of the other studies that we've been that are currently underway. Aurora is the biggest one, and we have some early results. I'm not quite ready to show them yet because we're still double checking everything. But it's a big study. It's 5,000 is the target. Each person followed over a year. So 5,000 times 365 days of data is what we're getting out of them. And I think they've recruited about 1,500 so far, and we're actively getting data from well over 1,000 participants right now. It's a study of the adverse post-traumatic neuropsychiatric sequelae. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the one most people are familiar with, but you might end up with depression after a traumatic event, mild traumatic brain injury, chronic pain. These are just some of the other things, and you can have a combination of all these, of course. And so it's an interesting study. They're recruiting subjects in the ER. So somebody's been in a car crash, and they get asked, do you want to participate in this study? And you put this app on your phone. They get Google's Verily is part of this as well. They have a watch that they're developing that does different kinds of physiological monitoring, heart rate, things like that, and a lot of questionnaires and interviews, and some subset of the subjects are going to get MRI, both functional MRI, diffusion, other structural scans, They get pain response, so how, one of the best predictors currently of whether you're going to develop PTSD is how you respond to pain after this traumatic event. Many people become more sensitive to pain because of this. And so it's kind of, it's a lot for people after you've been in this traumatic event. Oh, come and do this study and put your hand in this ice cold water and see how long you can keep it there. But it is very valuable data, and the goal is to figure out how to predict who, about 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 people will end up with some neuropsychiatric problem, even well after any physical harm has healed. And so being able to know who they are and kind of make sure that doesn't happen is very valuable. So anyway, as I said, we're getting some interesting effects, being able to use the phone data to guess who's developing PTSD or depression symptoms. Blackthorn is a drug company. It's a drug startup in San Francisco we've worked with. Drug companies are interested in getting better outcome measures. So right now they use the same things we use, for example, in the ketamine study, these structured interviews. And if, they're subjective, right? That somebody's saying, how are you feeling? And they have, it's a structured set of questions, but it basically boils down to how you're feeling today. And that's the metric of, is this new drug working or not, right? So they're worried that a lot of drugs either didn't get approved because, you just had a bad set of subjects, or you just, for whatever reason, maybe you didn't follow them long enough because, money is an issue. Or drugs do get approved and they're not that effective. So drug companies are looking for better ways to measure outcomes. So Blackthorn is one of them. That one's just finished. We're just processing the data now, so we should have something out on that soon. We're also working with Manhattan Psychiatric Center. It's a small study. It's only 25 subjects, but it's a very different population than we've looked at before. So it's in the city, some people have pretty severe psychiatric symptoms. So we're looking at that. We're getting what we call the hard outcomes, arrests, hospitalizations, changes in medication, things that where something big happened. That it's not just you answered a question, a questionnaire. This is the part 2 of the Michigan intern study. The data I showed was from last year's version, and we were just kind of a small part of it, and so we only got data on about, I think, 80 or 100 subjects. This year we're going to probably still not get all of them, but we'll probably get over 1,000. It looks like we're on target to get about 1,000. They're also doing genetics, so we're going to be looking at that as well. And RADAR, I don't know if you guys are familiar with RADAR. It's out of King's College London, is I think the main site. And they're interested in real-time clinical status of patients using remote assessment. And so they have their own apps that they've developed for doing this, and they're also using our app and looking to identify, I think they've expanded epilepsy and MS. The focus when we started was major depression, but they're looking to identify mobile signatures of depression and these other conditions. And so that is generating demographic variables. PHQ-8 is a self-report, depression index, and then lots of clinical data. And that's ongoing, and the data's rolling in, but we haven't analyzed it yet. So, yeah, just to summarize, we think we're building we're trying to build something that could be clinically useful. So it's interesting that we can predict somebody's IQ from their smartphone, but that's not going to help people really, right? What's going to help them is if we can actually produce a clinically useful tool. So I've shown you the measurement part. I'll just give you a quick preview of where we're taking it. So we are, we're actually 2 companies. I should say officially we're 2 companies. We're a tech company, Mindstrong Health Inc., and we are a healthcare company, so Mindstrong Health Services. Health Services is a professional corporation in the U.S. That's how most people who provide care are organized, not as a a regular corporation, but as a professional corporation, a group of doctors who, whose main focus is not some corporate bottom line, but is patient care. And most hospitals in the US are organized this way as well. There's two companies. And so Mindstrong, the tech company, is developing these apps. So we have an app that can show people if they're interested in tracking their own index of, in this case, cognitive control. This is, when we train against a model that predicts a cognitive control outcome, and then we can take that model and make cognitive control predictions on any data that come in. That's what we're showing here. And we're building a complete ecosystem. So this will be the patient-facing app, and then, I should also point out there's a messaging part, a secure, HIPAA-approved, safe for medical information, secure way of exchanging information between a healthcare provider and the patient. And then this is the healthcare provider's interface. So they can see the same kind of, the same data that the patient sees. They can interact with the patient. This is their whole panel of patients. They can see who, we have kind of status indicators when things are kind of going out. This patient's got some out of range values here, that way off their baseline, so their performance and cognitive control is pretty low here, high, and this is actually one of the patterns we're seeing. It's not just you go down if you're not doing well, but you could be just erratic, just kind of all over the place. And that's a sign that would show up as a priority status in this panel saying, hey, this is the person who you should talk to who might need help. And we have some preliminary data from, as I mentioned, hard outcomes. This is one case of a patient. These are a couple of the metrics that we have for the cognitive control working memory. This person self-admitted to a hospital for depression. And that's this period, the phone was turned off while they were in the hospital. That's why there's no data here. But you can see leading up to that event, things are quite erratic. They were just all over the place. After they were treated and were released, they stabilized in these metrics. Now, this is just one subject. It's an anecdote. But we are working with the state of California. They have something called an innovation fund. We got essentially a grant to deploy this as a trial. It's innovation fund. It's not expected to be something that's guaranteed to work, but it's a pilot project to see how well it works, and that's where we're at now. This is just another example of somebody with substance use disorder and had a relapse. In this case, you can see during the relapse, there might, there's maybe some signal showing up before the relapse, but definitely during the relapse, their performance dropped. And then when they were treated and released, things stabilized again. And again, we're not just throwing an app out to people, either to the patients or the doctors. We are actually going to be the healthcare providers in this case. And we're building our own network of healthcare providers so that we have the full circle completed. And that, I think, provides the best way to quickly iterate and develop and improve the models, and hopefully to provide the best care that we can provide. And this is just a summary. As I mentioned, outpatient care for severe mental illness is one of our main targets. It's something that we really think, in a sense, is the current bar is pretty low because the current state-of-the-art for outpatient care is pretty bad, at least in the U.S. I don't know how it is here. So we think we can have a pretty big impact there. The comorbidity is something that's important. Often primary care physicians, especially in the U.S., in rural areas, there's not a psychiatrist in 100 miles. And primary care physicians are often not excited about working with people who have mental problems. And so there's a bit of neglect on both sides in that case, especially, as I mentioned, the rural areas. So we think we can help in that case. As you noticed, the messaging, and we're also developing a video, direct face-to-face video chat, so that we can provide telehealth, especially in these cases where people are underserved. So the primary care physicians, I think, will be better able to handle even the primary condition, the diabetes or the heart condition, if they can get help dealing with the mental health issues. And as I mentioned, the drug companies are interested in not only using the tool to help develop drugs to get better outcomes, but also to manage this whole concept of beyond the pill, not just putting out a drug, but maybe a companion app that helps people take the drug more effectively. Because often a drug looks well in clinical trials, but the actual efficacy out in the real world, when people don't take it every day or whatever, it's not as useful as it seemed in the clinical trials. And we're also looking at helping in these, as I mentioned, high-risk cohorts where people, for example, children who have traumatic events, or mothers who are susceptible to I'm blanking on the name, but yes. And that, so anyone who's at high risk, right, who we know because of something that happened in their life, they're at high risk, it could be useful to help head off these problems. And so I think that's all I have. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. We have roaming microphones around these helpers here with the tops on. So, yeah, Thomas, why don't you kick us off?
So great talk, thank you. So you started with Google and how they make money. So how does Mindstrong make money? The tech company. The health service, I can see how that makes money. But the tech company, how does that make money?
Yeah, so, I mean, officially we license the technology to the health services company, and the reason they license it from us is because it helps them run more efficiently. The key here is the measurement, being able to triage the patients. So, the panel size, how many patients can a psychiatrist handle? And under the psychiatrist, there's often a team of psychologists and then at the lowest level, there's caseworkers. And by better triaging people, most people who are depressed and who are being treated for it are fine. And you want to find those 1 out of 100 people on this day who are not fine, who are, for whatever reason, the medicine's not working, or they stopped taking it, or whatever, they had a bad event, that's the person I want to reach out to and call. There's plenty of evidence that if, I think one of the big healthcare companies in the US, Humana, did a study where they found if they just randomly call people being treated for depression, and say, how are you doing? Most of the time they say, I'm fine, thanks for calling. But they will catch occasionally somebody who says, well, things aren't going so well, and they'll say, okay, can we get you in to see somebody? Can we change your medication? They know that works when you reach out to somebody and they're in a bad state, as somebody who wants to be helped, wants to be better. The problem is you just can't you don't want to call people constantly, you'll annoy them, and it's expensive. So that's where we think we can save money and so provide better care at a lower cost.
Okay. Anyone here? Actually, sorry, while you're there.
It's just a very quick question about whether the modeling that you do also accounts for human sort of behavior before there was this level of human-machine interaction. And so if you're going to roll it out as an app, and is it excluding people? Is it adjusting for how human beings actually interacted with, and how the mental health was affected by their day-to-day lives ahead of this sort of machine interaction? Thanks.
So, sorry, can you repeat? I didn't quite follow.
Models are taking into account human behavior and the progression of disease and things before there was this level of human-machine interaction. If in the future we're going to use these devices to actually track disease progression.
So is it accounting for how people behave,
Yeah,
or do you mean the effect, the kind of effect of actually using the phone?
Yes, and how disease would have been in an environment where we didn't have this level of human machine interaction?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about it. In a way, I'm not sure it matters, right? I mean, it is good to think about people who don't have phones, and that is something and there's one actually situation we didn't realize was so prevalent, but in certain populations, people share phones. And so if you're using your phone and you hand it to somebody else and they use it, we might think there's, we'll see things going all over the place, but it's no one's actually depressed in that case.
We've got one here, one is over here. Anyone on this side? I feel like I'm in the pantomime.
Hi, thanks. It sounds very interesting, but I'm always worried about overselling, and you never said anything about any of the negative potential effects, which always worries me. So, for example, and we know from the history of technologies, drugs, whatever, there's always more side effects than you think there are. So, for example, in the sleep one with the interns, you're predicting very extreme stuff there. These are people who are losing sleep on a quite extreme way.
Yeah.
So you've sort of a bit overtrained because you're just looking at sleep in that population, not sleep problems in the general population. You showed us areas under the curve, but under those figures was the positive predictive value, which is the key one. That's the proportion of those you say are positive that actually have a problem. And those were 0.5, 0.28. That's very low. That means that less than half of those who you're saying have got a problem actually do have a problem. Translate that to thousands of people who are experiencing this. They're going to get all these calls coming into them saying, we think you've got a problem, we think you've got a problem, when they won't.
Yeah.
So you've got to look at that side as well, I think. You didn't really address that.
No, that's a great question, and thank you. And we actually did actually push things to get a better negative predictive value because of this idea that our goal is to triage. And we don't want to miss somebody who's depressed and, needs help. And yes, that means the positive predictive value is going to be lower, and we're going to be making unnecessary calls. The calls, we're developing a system so that calls will be cheap. We first can reach out with text messaging. If we get a positive response, like everything's fine, we're good. If we get a negative response or no response, a human reaches out. And so, yes, there will be unnecessary calls, but we don't want to miss people. So for us, the negative predictive value is more important, and the positive predictive value needs to be high enough that we're not hitting everybody all the time. But, yeah. No, it's a good point.
Well, Trevor's asked my question, so I'll have to think of another. Oh, I will. I'm particularly interested whether yet you've got any data, particularly perhaps the softer qualitative data, and how being observed in this way affects people's phone behaviour. And I'm particularly thinking about some of the clinical populations, because I'm a psychiatrist, so on the one half, this really excites me, because I think we're so bad at predicting really adverse events like suicide.
Yeah.
And if we could do something that just increased and enhanced that, would be great. But on the other side, I'm thinking about that therapeutic relationship, because it's radically different depending on how people perceive this. So I'm thinking, what do you know so far about how this changes the phone use behaviour, particularly in people, for instance, who are depressed?
Right. To be totally honest, we can't answer that yet because we've been doing research. So we have people who self-select, who want to be part of this. Yeah, no, it's a fair question. We are rolling out at a broader population now. We have a collaboration with a health company. And so we will be able to answer that. And it's true, maybe we won't be able to help, maybe we're not right for everybody. And that's fine. Again, the bar is pretty low. I think we can have a big impact even if, schizophrenia is paranoid schizophrenia is one of the situations we worry about too. Are people really going to allow this app to be on their phone? Okay. So yeah, we'll learn that to come. So far, there have been plenty of people. Any place we've rolled in, as I said, we're working with the state of California. We're in their county clinics down in the trenches, and you know, it's voluntary. People choose to do it or not, but we've had pretty good excitement. So I'd say maybe not everyone, but a good number of people, maybe more than half, will be willing to, will want to do this because they want to stay well.
We're going to have, yes, although you have.
There's a hand up.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry.
This is a very quick question. It's kind of related to everything that everybody has been asking. My question is, I mean, we are incredibly flexible beings. We change. And knowing that there's an app there, would that change how you, I mean, it's like having a Fitbit. Ever since I got it, now I'm watching my steps. And everybody's had that experience.
Yeah.
That you want to kind of game the system in a way. So is there a safe way where you can kind of some way take care of that you're not gaming the system and you're not basically just making up data for the app for the sake of the app?
Yeah, one thing we're learning, we're just figuring out is it valuable to show this to the patient? And we don't know. We're trying it. And it could be we do or don't in specific cases, or we just don't in general. So I think that's a big part of it. If we don't show this, then it's just a messaging app that lets you reach out to your healthcare, your care provider whenever you want. And people actually are really excited about that. 24/7, they can send a message. We have 24/7 psychologists, waiting. And if they get a message, they can call somebody up. And as I said, they'll be soon able to do video chat. And so that's the patient's perspective. That's what they see. They see somebody's there. We may or may not find this useful, yeah.
One very quick question. I know you have.
One thing that's come out quite clearly is that this digital technology, these Fitbits, these phones, are not always accurate. In fact, some of them can be 50% out. So bear that in mind. Second thing is, I'm a techno dinosaur. I don't have a modern phone. In fact, I object to people unofficially taking information about me, and so you will find people like this. But my concern is, in the States, will it be mandatory for certain classes of patients to have this kind of equipment? Otherwise you don't get care? Or if you don't have care, you will be in trouble? I'm not talking Big Brother is watching you, but I can see Skynet.
To be honest, I haven't thought deeply. I mean, we think about this, and we know there are people who just aren't going to want to do this. That's fine, and that's their right. I would have actually flipped it. I would think a government-run healthcare would be more able to impose that kind of, you do this or you don't. In the U.S., one health insurance company could do that, but then there's 10 others that you could go to. I guess it's possible they would all force you to install this. I don't really imagine that happening, though.
Okay. In the case of SMIs and possible antisocial behaviour, decreased number of deaths. Just throwing it out there.
Bob's here for the rest of the day, so you can call in. And I'm sorry we didn't get to you. There's coffee outside. We meet back here at 11:30. Don't forget the 360. We'll adventure.